So a lot of our work is publicly funded. We want to make sure we can use that to benefit society wherever we possibly can.
When the previous spin-out company ended, my main concern was the people. It takes a lot of thought to actually go back down that path.
It gives you a bit more confidence this time that someone there saying, our market needs this.
Welcome to the Academic Adventures podcast. This podcast is all about people who have embraced the opportunity to combine their academic work with entrepreneurial ventures. You'll hear about the highs and lows, balancing responsibilities and grabbing opportunities, plus advice for anyone thinking about following a similar path. Hello, I'm your host Sarah McLusky, and my academic adventurers for this episode are Duncan Graham and Karen Faulds. They are both professors of chemistry at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. Along with partners Ewan Smith and Jim Reid, they founded the diagnostics spin-out company D3 Technologies in 2007. But this story doesn't begin there. The Raman spectroscopy-based test that they were looking to commercialise was patented back in the mid-1990s, and a complicated and cautionary tale follows. With investment from equipment manufacturer Renishaw, at one point the company employed 42 people, but challenges like protracted medical validation procedures and struggling to find enough customers meant that the company never quite became viable, and it ceased trading in 2016. Stung by the experience, it's only now that Duncan and Karen are considering dipping their toes back into these entrepreneurial waters, this time with some very clear market demand. So welcome, Duncan and Karen. Thanks so much for coming onto the podcast to tell us a bit about your experiences. So I think that's a good place to start. I wonder if you could tell us about the spin-out company you're involved with.
An open-ended question, I think. Where to begin? It's quite a long, build up to this, that we've been working on this technology known as surface-enhanced Raman scattering since before I joined the university in 1996. In fact, I joined in 1996 to work on a project sponsored by AstraZeneca, or Zeneca Diagnostics. It was before even Astra.
Going way back.
So yes, Zeneca Diagnostics had this idea that they could use surface-enhanced Raman scattering with an assay that they had developed for testing for DNA sequences relating to disease. And it had started with cystic fibrosis testing and looking for that main mutation which gave rise to the lack of the secretory protein. So we started off there, we filed various patents, we built it up over time. We thought we were aiming for a license deal with Zeneca, then AstraZeneca. Things change. The people we were working with within Zeneca Diagnostics left Zeneca Diagnostics, took their IP, formed a company which was subsequently sold to, I forget the name of the company, but they made a lot of money. So they were championing partly our technology, but also their own technology. We were then left with our IP, which had been assigned to Zeneca. And we wanted to do something with this. We weren't sure what to do because we're academics. So at that point, it was myself and Ewan Smith, who was the other academic in this set of three. And we were introduced to a number of different consultants. And I say a number, we went through maybe 6 or 7 different consultants.
Well, that's quite a few, yeah.
Yeah. Who came along and spoke to us about their vision for what we could do in this sector, how we could maximise the impact from the research and the IP. And it took us time. And in the meantime, we'd been continuing to file patents. We had continued to work with different companies in different parts of the inventive fields. We were licensing parts of our IP in various fields. We were working with companies like Philips, with an American company called, it turned out to be American in the end, but it was British to begin with, called Exonica. We had various license deals. It was quite complicated how we were going to exploit this. And then eventually we were introduced to a business consultant who had previously worked for Roche, understood the DNA diagnostics market, and was interested in this new technology and suggested that we form a spin-out company. And from that point, we felt that would probably be the best way to do it. So eventually we got all the ducks lined up and we created a spin-out company that was formed, was called D3 Technologies, in July 2007. So approximately 11 years after we'd first filed that core patent, we eventually formed a spin-out company.
It sounds like it took a long time, but you've explained there quite well why it took a long time with all this exploring all these different ideas and things.
Yes, and it's challenging because when I started out, I was on fixed-term, short-term contracts. I didn't know what I was going to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
And we had other people joining the group. So Karen joined as a PhD student and a postdoc, then became a member of staff, and we didn't know how that was going to turn out. Ewan was coming up towards retirement, so what was he going to do? So it was all a mixture of the people involved, the patents that we'd sub-licensed and licensed to other companies, and then what the field in general was doing in terms of advancing to create new capabilities for the area of DNA testing, which is what we were trying to work on. So it was a complicated matrix. And at some point, it all seemed to align because Ewan got to 2007, which was his retirement year. Mm-hmm. He said, well, I'll retire, but I'll become the first CEO of the company. So that worked out quite well. Karen then became the academic in the SERS world at Strathclyde, taking over from Ewan. I was an academic there already, and we had that consultant who came along to work with us with the company, and he became one of the founding members as well.
Excellent. So you've said a little bit there about the different roles that people took in the team. So you said Ewan was your CEO, and then how did the rest of the team come together? Was it just the four of you that you've mentioned there? Were there other people involved?
So at the beginning, to get it set up, Ewan was really the senior guy driving this, mm-hmm. along with our external advisor who came along. We then approached a major corporation who we wanted to invest into the company. So we managed to secure some initial investment from them. So we set up the company, and then we basically we sold equity to them after we set it up almost immediately. And that then set the roles and responsibilities within the company from an early stage. And then we started to employ people into the company. So really, the founding members of the company were myself, Ewan Smith, Karen, our external mentor, who's a guy called Jim Reed, and then they were and the university. So there were 5 founding members. And then we sold equity to Renishaw, who then came on board to become a major partner.
Oh, and on reflection, did that feel like it was the right way to structure the team, or were there any challenges with that setup?
So at the time, it felt the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. Renishaw are a major engineering company. They have significant revenues. They make some of the best Raman spectrometers in the world. And we were using Raman spectroscopy as our detection technique for the science. And we know that the majority of any clinical test, in fact, almost all clinical testing labs would not have a Raman instrument. So we knew they needed to have a Raman instrument before they could accept our technology. So it seemed like a good match that we would go with an engineering company who could make those instruments, make the hardware, mm-hmm. the testing laboratories with the capabilities that they needed.
Yeah, well, and so it worked out in the sense that the company operated for a period of time. What was the story after you got things off the ground then?
Well, that's where it gets a bit more complicated because we started off down one avenue of a target. We were going to do some sexual disease testing, looking at a multiplexed assay for chlamydia, gonorrhea. And we started down that route. And then we realised that there was significant market presence from really large players like your Roches and your Becton Dickinsons. And for us to come in and be disruptive in that already saturated market was going to be really, really challenging. So we spent a bit of time trying to understand where we did have an opportunity in terms of bringing in a new capability to an unmet need mm-hmm. in that clinical testing market. And that's where we came up with the fungal testing, which is where we pushed most of our efforts. So that was testing for fungal infections in hospitals using a multiplex DNA testing assay. So we would be looking for classification of different fungal infections which were deep-seated and were very, very difficult to get rid of and could be potentially fatal in some cases because the most effective treatments are only about 50% effective. So it's a real problem when you have a deep-seated fungal infection, particularly in hospital, and immune-compromised patients. And we were trying to line up our tests so that we could link it to the therapies which would be administered in the end. So instead of trying to speciate exactly what that was, it would be, could we link the detection diagnostic to the treatment that would then be administered? So it might be a drug against aspergillus or a drug against candida. So that's where we went with the science. Behind that, we were employing people because we needed new capability. We moved into our own bespoke premises, which we kitted out to cover molecular biology, fabrication, packaging of kits, etc. We got up to 42 FTE in these premises. That cost money. So we had to take some more investment from Renishaw. They were the only people who were investing into the company. At that point, though, we still had leaky IP.
Right.
So you may have recalled that earlier in the conversation I said before we spun out, we'd been working with other companies. We'd been creating license deals with them. And some of the clauses in those license deals allowed them to sub-license other parties. And it took us quite a while to shore up the IP situation and get that into a nice consolidated package, which we then, at that point it was owned by the university, we were then able to offer that to D3 Technologies as the IP package. And at that point we were asking for more investment from Renishaw, and they felt it would then be appropriate to consider a name change from D3 Technologies and also to make it a subsidiary of the Renishaw Group. So it became Renishaw Diagnostics. I think it was about 2010, if memory serves, that we did that name change in the next round of investment. So we were pushing on with the science, shoring up the IP. We were also trying to manufacture, let's call it something a bit more abstract, some substrates that you could do other measurements with. So it was a complete sideline to see if we could generate some revenues in the meantime while we went for clinical accreditation of the main product.
So it sounds like, goodness me, you've got a lot going on there all at one time with all these people and these different kind of products and things like that. You've said there you took a pivot with the science. Was that quite a straightforward pivot to go from looking from sexually transmitted diseases to fungal infections, or?
The technology remains the same, but the biology changed. And biology was actually quite complicated.
Yeah.
But a lot of effort went in terms of getting the biology right. Then we had to work out how we could translate what we would do in the lab as expert SERS users into the hands of a clinical laboratory. So we started to invest in robotic systems for liquid handling. We also had one eye on the future because the assay we patented was back from 1997. Changed anything really since then, and this was like 12, 13 years later. So we're thinking, how can we update our technology to make it keep pace with the current developments that are going on within that sector? So the relationship moved from, I guess, the company became quite self-sufficient and it was running itself. From the academic engagement, then you had myself and Karen as the academics still at the university. We became much more involved in the next generation of the potential product pipeline. And for that, we secured, as it was then, TSB funding, now Innovate, that allowed us to run a 3-year program with the company with an academic focus on getting the basic research done, which would look into the next generation of product for the company. So that was the relationship that started to develop with the university and with the spin-out company, which was quite fruitful, actually.
Yeah, so it sounds like, once you get one thing into sort of almost production, getting it into that actual delivery stage, you always have to be going back to the science and thinking about what's the next thing coming through.
Absolutely. However, I wouldn't say we were into production.
Okay.
Because there are lots and lots of challenges in terms of which market you look at, how you get your test accepted and validated. And this was something we did not fully understand when we went into this. And in fact, it took us a lot more time, effort, and finance to get a CE mark on our assay than we'd considered. And even then, when we had the CE mark, to get that accepted as an approved test that the hospitals would buy and buy in volume was a real challenge that we didn't really actually overcome.
So what were some of the steps and things that you had to go through?
So that's where the joy of having a full-time compliance officer within the company comes in, because they have the responsibility for working out what needs to be done, the documentation that needs to be provided, the rigour that needs to be put into testing a fridge for over 6 months that it holds the temperature and it doesn't change, so you can say your reagents are actually genuine and they haven't been affected. So there was a lot of work going on within the company in terms of the standardisation of the science that was being done. It was locked in. Everything had to be locked in, finalised. Then we had to run hundreds of samples for verification, validation. Then we had to submit more paperwork, get accreditation. So it was a lot of work, a lot of
and
effort.
also getting it into different hospitals to get on-site testing as well. So the amount of cost validation, preparation to get it into the clinical setting is also very challenging. And all of this is just so expensive to bring, a clinical diagnostic to market. It's just a huge hurdle financially.
And is it particularly difficult in that clinical setting just because of all the hoops you've got to go through? Or is this common in other industries?
There's always accreditation for any new test. You've got to get to gold standard and show you have at least comparable performance against the gold standard, depending on which sector you're moving into. But the medical diagnostic sector we were moving into was challenging. It did have significant levels of accreditation. We looked at Europe first. We were still in Europe at that point, so we went for the CE marking. We looked at FDA approval, and that was going to be another level of scrutiny and paperwork and effort and cost. So we didn't go down the FDA approval route in the end. We focused very much on the CE marking. And as Karen said, we ended up having systems placed in 5 hospitals across Europe for testing. But we were paying quite a lot of money for those tests to be run and to get the data to allow us to then use that data to say, hey, look, it works, and this is how well it works, etc., with a view that then they were going to pick up and take these tests and then make this a financially sustainable assay and product. Fungal testing was important, but it wasn't a massive market in terms of the number of samples that were going to be run every year. And when you get to a point where you've spent a lot of money, and then you can speculate how much you're expecting to get back, and you need to make those lines start to cross at some point so that you move into surplus generation or profit in a company. And we felt that the fungal testing was probably not going to do that. So we came up with new tests. So we started to move into gastroenteritis, where there was much higher volume of testing, but that was more challenging again because we had to go back and redo the biology because the DNA behaved differently. So it always felt as though there was just within grasp, but never quite getting there.
It sounds like everything you've talked about, even all the way up to this point. I mean, in terms of time, where are we in the timeline of the company? How many years had this been to get to this point?
So we're probably 7 or 8 years at this point.
Yeah, and there's still not got something that you're selling? Yeah.
We're selling some very bespoke, specialised substrates with interest to the research community. It's certainly not providing revenues which are propping up the company when you've got that number of employees.
No. And so where does the story go from there?
Well, we were enthusiasts as the inventors of the science, and having worked on that technique for a long time and still continue to work in this sector, we wanted to try and make it work, but we were starting to realise that we were facing probably insurmountable barriers to actually make this a financially viable product. And the decision was taken in 2016 that we would cease to operate as the company was, and we'd look around to see if anybody was interested in taking on the technology or parts of the technology. And that's what happened at the end in 2016. There was a part of the technology that was taken on by another company.
It's really sobering to hear just how much goes into getting to that point. And I imagine it must have been a very sobering moment for yourselves as well.
Well, I think the other part is because this is quite a specialist technique, there's not many people doing it. So there was an entry to market barrier and acceptance that we were also aware of. But also having skilled people who could work in the company. A lot of our former PhD and postdoctoral researchers from our research group ended up working in the company. So when you realised that the company was no longer going to continue in its current form, you really did get quite concerned, a very stressful time about what would happen to them when this company ceased to operate in the way that it was, because finding specialist jobs of that nature is not that easy, and that's what they were doing. Fortunately, I think most people have managed to move on to other jobs or stayed within the company that took over. But yeah, it was not a pleasant time.
No, I can imagine. Looking back on it now, though, I imagine there are things that you feel you've learned from that experience. So what do you think are the biggest things that you've taken away from it?
I think the biggest thing for me, and I'll let Karen talk for herself, but the biggest thing for me is really understand the market you're going into and get that market pool identified for your technology and your product. We were technology pushing into different markets, and that was really tough. What we need to do is make sure we have a market pool, and then the technology can be molded to that market need. That's the only way I think we can ever be financially sustainable with the technology development. I also learned that I am very much an academic. So we want to see our technology translated into impact and societal and economic benefits. That's not what floats my boat. Mm-hmm. I think I'm best staying in academia. That said, we will dip our toes back in the water again in terms of trying to make sure we realise the impacts. A lot of our work is publicly funded. Mm-hmm. We want to make sure we can use that to benefit society wherever we possibly can. And we have learned lessons. So that's my point.
Yeah.
I think I'd say the exact same as Duncan, and perhaps rephrased it a little bit, but it's the same thing. I think we were a technology looking for an application, a really good technology, but we didn't quite have the application that was going to pull it through to, high value. And as Duncan said, we're, considering another spin-out company in a different area where we definitely have the need being the pool for the technology now. And I think it's taken me a long time to even perhaps consider spinning out another company again, because I think, and Duncan again, it's reiterating what he said, but when the previous spin-out company ended, my main concern was the people that were employed in it. And, it kind of takes a lot of thought to actually go back down that path again, because you're bringing people with you, you get people invested in working for the company, and if it doesn't work out, it's like ensuring that they have somewhere to go after it. And, that part for me took a bit of time maybe to get over, and for me to consider going down that path again. But I think we're in a different position now and knowing more than what we did the first time round.
Yeah, well, I think that's all any of us can do, isn't it? Is learn from our experiences. And either when you were going through the process last time, or perhaps as you're coming to now think about doing it again, is there any particular support that's been really valuable to you? You've mentioned IP, you've mentioned a compliance officer, these roles. Are there any particular things that have been really helpful to getting you the progress that you did?
In the past or in the future?
In the past or in the future, or where you are now. Yeah, maybe things have changed.
Things have changed, without doubt. In the past, it was a different process to spinning out a company, certainly within our university. Mm-hmm. Now we have a very structured approach to spinning out. We have a gated process, which is very clear what's expected of you at each stage. You're given support and some financial support from the university to go through these different stages. And it's really clear what you need to do and how you have to reach the next stage in the gate. And you're given a lot of support internally, and then externally people are brought in to help you. So I think for me, the support round about us within the university is excellent. And I can say we have 10 current spin-out companies in the Faculty of Science with an investment value of over 55 million that are current now. So I think the university's actually got the structure right to this, and the environment is right. There are going to be failures, of course there are. We had a failure. but you learn from those and you dust yourself down and you try and move on. So the support from the university is absolutely valuable. The latest venture, which we're looking at, actually, the market contacted Karen and said, have you got a technology that could maybe solve a problem here? So again, that interaction and engagement has really helped us think about, will we do it, will we not do it? It gives you a bit more confidence this time that there's someone there saying, our market needs this. You guys have got something that can do it. So that relationship has been really important as well.
Yeah, interesting. Sounds like a more of a two-way conversation now as well.
Yeah, and it means the market has been involved in some of the research phase of it as well, so has been involved in the development of the science and the direction that fundamental science has gone that sits behind it. So there's been a lot more of testing and understanding the need this time before that we jump, if that makes sense, and really understanding that also that our technology already is a fit for the market that we want to put it into.
And it sounds like, Duncan, certainly you've said, I don't know perhaps if it's the same for you, Karen, but you've said that you feel that you're very much an academic rather than the entrepreneur. How do you merge those two parts of your identity together? How do you balance those responsibilities? Again, perhaps how did you in the past, or how is it different now?
I mean, it can be challenging at times because you've got, two jobs to do, and I think it's challenging at this stage because you're trying to do your day jobs, finding research funding, but also trying to explore opportunities of, funding and the potential spin out and interaction with various people. So I think this is probably the start of the challenging phase of just balancing that time, because obviously you need to be involved in those early stages to get it off the ground. But as Duncan has also said, I see myself as an academic, and I'm happy to do that initial push off and be involved. But once you've let the bird out the box, hopefully you'll be able to take off on it.
Yes. Oh, well, fingers crossed. And has your idea of what it would mean to succeed changed? What you're saying there suggests that perhaps it has, but
I still think the biggest success would be seeing research which you've done in your laboratories with PhD students and postdocs that you've conceived of conceptually being used in a situation which is benefiting either society or a company through its ability to make the world a better place. That sounds rather grand and a bit motherhood and apple pie, but really it's just seeing that research going out from the laboratories and being used and making a difference to society and hopefully the economy.
It's good to know that that ambition is still there, that vision is still there, and you haven't been put off by it. So that perhaps is a good place to say, if somebody else is thinking about following a similar path, what advice would you give them?
Find someone who's done it before and speak to them. Definitely do that, because the more advice and testing of your thoughts that you can do, the better you're going to be in your decision making. And that's where I think this gated process I talked to you about from the university perspective is really helpful, because we get that environment where there's been a lot of other spin-outs going on, some very successful, where we can learn from the people who've done it and how they've done it and gone about it. And it gives you the confidence it can work and it can be done. And you just have to then transpose what they've done into your situation and scenarios and try and make it work. So the advice I would give is certainly speak to other people who've done it before.
Yeah. And Karen, would you add anything else to that?
Well, that would be also to speak to the potential end users to make sure that you are actually selling a technology that the world needs, or not trying to tell them they need this and they don't really, because, it's always the same. If you use the clinical example, it's quite often a lot of technology of trying to push into that clinical market. But have you actually spoken to a clinician and said, well, actually, how would this impact your the treatment pathway? That's a good example. And they go, well, actually, it wouldn't make that much difference. If I get a result an hour earlier, it actually wouldn't make any difference because of the way the pathway is. So I think actually really talking to people that might be using the technology at the end of the day is actually really important at the early stages, because it could be you can adjust something to accommodate, or you're actually looking at the wrong market or the wrong target that can be changed.
Yeah. Both excellent pieces of advice, I think. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to have a chat with me. That's been so interesting. Thank you.
No problem at all.
Thank you.
If you've been inspired by this podcast, head over to our LinkedIn page and tell us about your biggest takeaways. You'll find a link in the show notes or just search for Academic Adventures Podcast. This podcast is a collaboration between the University of the West of Scotland, Converge and Sarah McLusky. The podcast team includes Orla Kelly, Adam Kosterka, Jen Black and me, Sarah McLusky. The Academic Adventures podcast is proudly supported by the Scottish Ecosystem Fund 2023 to 2024.